Okay, we're back. Now that we've established the what are the Gospels and what is this Gospel writing that's been named John, let's now talk about the who. Who wrote this? Well, just like many other writings in the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, ultimately we cannot say with absolute authority who wrote many of these books, and certainly that would be true of the gospel. So at best we could say that the question of authorship remains to some extent unanswered, though there are some strong beliefs regarding who might be the authors. The reason why there's some reservation with saying exactly who wrote some of these writings, including the Gospel of John, is because we have to remember that originally the Gospels circulated in oral form, and then even when they began to circulate in the Christian communities in written form, they didn't even have names attached to them. So when they were first circulating in oral form and written form, you didn't have the name Mark and Matthew and Luke and John on these various writings. The names were not attached to these writings until well after the time that they had been circulating in Christian communities orally as well as in written form. So that's why there always will remain a shadow of a doubt regarding who actually wrote these documents, because again, the names were not originally attached. Now, I don't offer this to rock your faith or anything, but just offering real information. Now, there's a strong belief from many scholars as well as many Christian believers that the disciple John wrote the Gospel of John. The same disciple who the Bible says was a disciple whom Jesus loved, and that disciple usually is identified as John. So many scholars and many Christians and others believe that the Gospel of John was written by the disciple John, aka the disciple whom Jesus loved. Now, there's some evidence that would seem to point to the fact that John, or the belief rather, that John the disciple wrote the gospel. One piece of information is that the author or writer of this gospel seems to be a personal witness of the events that he writes about. Rather than writing about something second and third hand, he seems to be an eyewitness to the things that he's writing about. He also seems to have intimate knowledge of Jesus' interaction with the disciples. What Jesus said, what they talked about, what the disciples said to him, back and forth, etc., etc. He seems to know these intimate details that usually only somebody who had been present would have these details. And then also, he seems to have insight into Jesus' thoughts, meaning that he understood how Jesus would think and how he would talk, etc., etc. Information that usually comes from being around someone and witnessing interaction with them firsthand. And then also in the closing of this gospel, chapter 21, verse 20, it tells of the interaction of Jesus with the disciple whom Jesus loved, who we believed is the disciple John. So those are some strong, what we call intertextual reasons for believing that John the disciple was the author of the Gospel of John. Intertextual meaning these are some clues that are in the written text themselves. This eternal evidence, as I said, even if we didn't immediately settle upon the disciple John as the author, we would have to, using this internal evidence, at least believe that it was somebody in Jesus' inner circle. And we know the closest persons to Jesus, historically speaking, were, number one, Peter, James, his brother or cousin, and John. The text would suggest that those were the people in Jesus' inner circle. So let's go through the process of elimination. We rule Peter out as the author because when Peter's name is brought up in the Gospel of John, it's always in the third person. That Peter never speaks in the first person. The author is constantly talking about Peter in the third person. And then, so we rule Peter out. And then we can rule James out because we believe that this gospel wasn't written until the 90s of the Common Era. And we know that James, the brother or cousin of Jesus, had already been martyred in the year 44 of the Common Era. And we can read about that in Acts chapter 12, verse 2. And so we know or believe whoever the author was somebody in the inner circle. The inner circle consisted of Peter, James, and John. We've ruled out Peter and James as the authors. And so we land on John, the disciple, as being the person who wrote this fourth gospel. John was also known as John the Evangelist. Now, there's also some external evidence that would point to John's authorship. This external evidence is the fact that some of the very earliest church leaders, particularly powerful bishops, they each believed that John was the scribe or the author, such as Bishop Irenaeus, who was a very powerful bishop in Lyons, Theophilus, a well-known figure at that time. Also, Clement of Alexandria, another very powerful church leader. And then even into the 4th century, the famed historian Eusebius, who wrote a history of the church from its beginnings through his time in the 4th century of the Common Era. So all of these early church leaders, powerful leaders, all believed that John the disciple was the author of the Gospel of John. And you know how it is. If my bishop believes it, my bishop says it, then I'm going to believe it as well. And so again, external evidence points to John as being a strong suggestion for having been the author of the fourth Gospels. Now, my thoughts might be a little different. Ultimately, I lean towards the belief that the author was probably a Palestinian Jew, because again, we know he understood the customs of that area and the customs of the Jewish people. So we believe he was a Palestinian Jew. He definitely had firsthand knowledge of Jerusalem and the surrounding country. He had his facts straight. You didn't have to fact check him. When you fact check the details that he gives in the gospel, they all pretty much pan out to be what he says they are. And so I believe that whoever it was, he was a Palestinian Jew who definitely had firsthand knowledge of those things he wrote about. I don't know if I believe definitively and absolutely that it was the disciple John, but guess what? No matter who wrote it and who I believe wrote it, doesn't have anything to do with my salvation, right? because my faith is not in the author of this writing or any other biblical writing, but my faith is in the message of the writings, this message that is inspired by God for our edification. All right, we're going to take another quick break and then we will come back.